Welcome to Whisperwood Stories. Today, we're going to do something a little different, a little mix and match. We're going to be reading one story from r/missing411 and two stories from r/paranormal. Let's start with our missing411 story. Our first story is from Decepticon Hooker. A little setup. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Since then, I have always lived on the edge of a body of water, mainly the Great Lakes, Erie, and Ontario. I currently live in a county that has been previously mentioned in one of the missing411 cases. My partner and I have been avid campers since our time together. We don't go anywhere too extreme and opt out of well-traversed campgrounds, as we love meeting and getting to know other campers. One of our favorite spots is a man-made quarry turned private, fenced-in campground that boasts around 3,000 campsites in rural Idaho. This incident happened at that campground, September 28th, 2019. We brought our camper instead of our tent gear, but were stuck up by the front gates with all of the other RVs and pull-behind campers. We were bummed by this since we love spending time in the woods, so we opted to spend most of the weekend hiking through the woods and visiting other campsites. Late in the evening, we were doing one of our hikes when we came up with the brilliant idea to get lost, or walk with no direction and just take different paths and turns as we came across them. Since it's all fenced in, we figured there wasn't much bad that could happen. All of our twists and turns ended up taking us to the very back of the campgrounds, where campsites are much more far apart from each other and neighbor several hundred acres of forest behind the campground's fences. It was a nice, quiet stroll and went on for a while. My partner noticed a porta-john and stated that he needed to make a stop. I said okay, and kept walking ahead, both to give him some privacy and just to drink in the beautiful summer night alone. I stopped maybe 30 feet ahead down the path. A few minutes passed before something happened. As I was standing with my back to the porta-john, I heard a rustling noise behind me, then a thud. Thinking it was my partner finishing up and exiting the porta-john, I waited a couple more seconds as I looked out into the woods for him to catch up to me. My partner is tall and athletic, and I heard him running up behind me. I both heard the footfalls and felt him come up behind me quickly as if he was trying to spook me. I smiled and spun around really fast to look up at him and catch him right in the act before he could touch me. But to my shock, when I spun around, there was no one there. No one. Not my partner. Not another person on the path. No one even in the sparse campsites within eyesight. But I swear on my life I could still feel someone now standing directly in front of me. Someone or something just as tall, if not taller, than my partner. I know what it feels like to have him tower over me, and I had the same sensation. I instantly dropped my smile and froze. I didn't know what to do. I felt like if I moved, I was in serious danger and felt like I suddenly couldn't hear anything. It felt like time stopped, and I didn't even want to breathe. The air got heavy and tense, almost like it got very humid very fast. Just as it felt like the tension was at its peak, my partner exited the porta-john and loudly started talking to me while walking over. As soon as he was within 8 feet of me, the sensation of someone standing in front of me disappeared. The air cleared, and the heaviness quickly dissipated. The whole incident couldn't have been more than 20 seconds long, but it felt so much longer. I said nothing, and we continued walking, but shaken, I asked to head back to our camper. I genuinely believe that if I had walked just a little bit farther ahead of my partner, and he had just taken a minute longer, I wouldn't be typing this. I can't help but feel that I dodged a bullet that night, even though I had no idea what I could have been facing at the time, as I didn't discover the missing411 phenomenon until this year. I'm grateful for my partner every day and view him as my protector. I would love to know your guys' thoughts. Thanks for listening. Now we move on to our r/paranormal stories. Our second story is by Jumpy Estimate. This starts like a usual haunted house story. I moved into a new house in a typical suburb of Australia with my 2 kids who were about 7 and 8 at the time. It was a brick house, had a big yard, bush land in the back, and a massive water reservoir directly behind it. The neighbors were lovely, chatty, and soon told me about the previous owner, who had pretty much moved out in the middle of the night without a word. My strange experiences in this house started off small. I would think that I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A light turned on or off that I didn't remember turning on. Then my daughter would come to me, asking what I wanted as I had called her name, though I never had. She told me about an old man in her room that terrified her, saying he had funny eyes. My son, who has ASD, refused to enter the spare room. Not even to get his iPad, which meant the world to him. He would stand at the door, not putting one toe over that line. Then it escalated to appliances turning on by themselves. The kettle, the TV, more lights turning off and on right in front of you. The garage door would open up, though this wasn't an electronic door, it was old school, one that you had to lift by yourself. I'd sometimes hear heavy breathing directly behind me. Our dog would stare inside the glass doors and growl and bark, but wouldn't come inside. When the children would be at their dad's, I'd sleep with my door closed and hear knocking. I knew what it could be, so I never opened the door. When the kids were home, I'd hear talking, then hear the sound of walking on the carpet, so I'd turn on my bedside lamp thinking it was one of the kids. Then there was no one there. I'd physically go and check on them, and they'd be fast asleep. I'd go back to bed, hear the walking again, and feel the presence of something. Almost like a face was about to touch my own. Though I never opened my eyes, I just ignored it. Despite all of this, it was 2 things that happened later that made me cut my losses and leave. I was in bed watching TV when I saw this shadow man. He was clear as day, made no attempt to hide, and walked around one side of the room to the other. It was very deliberate, like it wanted me to know it was there. The second thing was when I was walking past the glass sliding doors, I noticed my dog standing in a stiff hunting stance. He also looked terrified. When I came out to see what he was looking at, I became immediately ill, terrified, unable to move. Perched on the back of the chair was the biggest blackbird I've ever seen. This bird was about 1 meter in height, or 3 feet, and its girth was huge. My dog was 42 kilograms, or 90 pounds, and this bird was way bigger than him. It had 3 massive talons and was completely black. It looked like its head was tucked into its wings, roosting like a pigeon. But then it turned to directly face us, and I realized it had no head. It wasn't decapitated, it just had no head. It stared straight at me as if it could see, then hopped onto the ground, and hopped twice more before jumping onto the top of my 6-foot fence and disappearing over it. Now this bird didn't walk, just hopped, and didn't flap any wings to get to the top of the fence. It jumped from a standing position. We were out of that house shortly after, and I haven't had any issues since with anything paranormal. All I know is that it makes sense to me now why the previous residents left in the middle of the night. Our last story is from Dova Beard. When I was 9, my family was clawing their way out of poverty. My dad would go by garage sales, or his coworkers would give him toys that their own children no longer wanted. So, while we were poor, Dad desperately did his best to spoil us in the little ways that he could. My dad kind of believes in the paranormal, but refuses to acknowledge it when it's time to man up and face the problem, as he says. Around this time, I was on the cusp of ghost adventures. I loved the mystery and suspense of the show, and while it made me paranoid, it wasn't bad and I barely showed outward fear. This detail is important because my parents at the time had formed this narrative that watching ghost stuff was making me not function right as a person, which made them delegitimize any real or tangible paranoia I had. At some point in my 9-year-old life, my father's coworker's grandmother gave us 3 expensive ceramic dolls out of the hundreds that this grandmother had. They all had glass eyes, whose eyelids would move should you lay the doll in a certain position. You could move them with your finger, but the lids rolled back too far to pull, and pulling risked damaging the long eyelashes these dolls had. The first 2 dolls I loved. One was a mermaid and one was a nurse. Because they were ceramic, my dad would put them into a box when we were storing them so they wouldn't get damaged. However, there's still the 3rd doll to talk about. My dad placed it front and center where I could see it at the top shelf in my room, and it could see me. This doll was bedazzled in hand-woven attire and wore a headdress made from real feathers. The doll's eyes were glass but had pure crystal pupils. I thought that it was gorgeous, but from the get-go, something felt wrong with this particular doll. In the 2 months that this doll sat and watched me, I began hearing a strange tapping on my pillow at night. Some items on my desk would fall off, and as I'd close my eyes, I would swear that I could see those difficult eyelids close on their own. One night, I thought that I could hear crying coming from it. It seemed that nothing was there in reality, but I had decided that enough was enough. I went to my dad the next day. I told my dad that all of the dolls were so pretty, but the feather one, it didn't feel right. My dad was confused. He asked me what I meant, but once again, all I could say was that the feathered one just didn't feel right. My dad looked at me strange, but said that he'd find a new home for that one. He asked me again if I was sure that I didn't want it. I assured him that I didn't. His eyes got a little wide and he left for work, and I went to school. Later that night, I was trying to sleep, and I heard Dad come into the doorway to check on me, but I looked dead asleep, so he didn't come in. I heard him stand there a while, and he was there for probably 5 minutes. Eventually, I heard him gasp and run. When I woke up, the doll was gone. I never saw it again, and my dad, to this day, pretends that it never existed. I don't know what he saw that night, but it must have been enough to send that doll into the void. Thank you for listening to Whisper Woods Stories. If you enjoyed, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe down below. Do you have a story that you'd like me to read here? Consider sending it to whisperwoodsubmissions@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and don't let the shadows get too close.